Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad to have you guys with us this week. And this week we're going to talk about someone I've been very fascinated with over the years, ever since I became interested in history, and that is the Marquis de Lafayette. And this is an American war hero, somebody who was a leader in George Washington's company, born in France, and then came over as a teenager to join the American cause, and comes from a very fascinating background. If you think about Lafayette, grew up in a very wealthy family in France, grew up at a country residence or country chateau outside of Paris. And in doing that, had a father who was a war hero and died when he was 2 years old in battle against the British. And this is why he held a hatred for the British people his entire life, because he was always thinking about the retribution for his father who died at the hands of the British, but was a French war hero. And so he spent most of his growing up years wanting to be a military hero one day like his father. And so when he became a teenager, he was brought back into Paris with his family and became a student at that time, and then started going to military training school. And he started hearing about this revolution that was going on in the colonies in America. And he started to really kind of think about and dramatize what it would be like if he could get involved. And so as a teenager, he was telling everybody at the time that he really wanted to go. And what's interesting is the king of France at the time made it illegal for anybody to go over and join the American cause at that time. And he flouted that. And when he was a teenager, along with some of his people that were around him, ended up buying a ship, since he had a lot of means and he was very wealthy. And he sailed to America and just took a chance that he was going to go join the Continental Army, and he wanted to meet George Washington. He took this huge risk to go participate in the American Revolution, and didn't really know what he was going to be in for until he got over there. But he wanted to be there. He wanted to get glory for himself, for his name, and for his father's name. And he believed very strongly in what the Americans were doing. And of course, he detested the British. So he wanted to do what he could to try to fight them and get independence on behalf of the Americans. And so we're going to go into tonight all of the history of his involvement in the American Revolution. We'll talk about some of the little known parts of his life. People don't know that he was involved in two French revolutions, one in 1789 and one in 1830. So he was truly a war hero on both sides of the Atlantic. He was an American war hero in the American Revolution, very important in the process of helping the Americans get their independence from England. And then he was a very important part of both French revolutions, as you'll find out tonight. This is a man who I've been fascinated with for a long, long time. I've always admired him. I've always thought how brave it would be for him to come over as a teenager and join this cause that he didn't know much about, but just took a chance. He ended up becoming essentially the son that George Washington never had. That's how close they got. And he really was one of his closest confidants and one of his most important generals during the war. So let's go ahead and get into the Marquis de Lafayette. So the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American and French revolutions. He was born in 1757 and died in 1834. You see the American Revolutionary or colonial flag there on the left, the one created by Betsy Ross for George Washington. And then you see the French flag at that time. It's a little different from the modern French flag, but that's the flag they used to fly during the French Revolution, especially in 1789 when they stormed the Bastille. And you see some great photos here of Marquis de Lafayette at different stages of his life in his military uniforms, both his uniform he wore on behalf of the Americans in the American Revolution and also his one that he wore for the French as they were fighting for their independence from monarchy. Great photo there on the bottom as he meets George Washington for the first time and shakes his hand. And then on the right there is a picture of Lafayette standing next to George Washington as his aide-de-camp and essentially one of his top advisors. They're there in one of the camps getting ready for one of their battles. in the American Revolution and the struggle for independence. So some great photos there of Lafayette, as you can see. So Marquis de Lafayette, he was born with this very long name, as you can see here, Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette. So that was his full name, which is pretty incredible. His short name, of course, is Marquis de Lafayette, but Marquis is not the name that he went by. Marquis is actually a title for a French nobleman. His father was also the Marquis de Lafayette. The name he actually went by to his family and friends was Gilbert. So Gilbert was the name he went by. So as you see, he was born September 6, 1757, and died May 20th of 1834. He was a French military officer and politician who volunteered to join the Continental Army, led by General George Washington in the American Revolutionary War. Lafayette commanded Continental Army troops in the decisive siege of Yorktown in 1781, the Revolutionary War's final major battle, which secured American independence. After returning to France after the war, Lafayette became a key figure in the French Revolution of 1789 and the July Revolution of 1830, which was some 40 years later. And he continues to be celebrated as a hero in both France and the United States. And you can see another great picture there on the bottom, Lafayette and the American Revolution. And then just above that was actually a portrait of Lafayette that is still, even today, hanging in George Washington's home. And as we talked about, they were very, very close. So his early life, Lafayette, as he is most often referred to today, was born and baptized in 1757 with the name Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette. But his family and friends only simply knew him as Gilbert. Lafayette was born in Chavagnac, which is a district of south central France, in a castle called the Chateau Chavagnac, which had been the home of his family for hundreds of years. So many, many generations, they had been noble people and very wealthy in French history. You see a picture there to the right of what the chateau looks like even today. You can actually visit it, and there's a museum there. This is the childhood home of Lafayette and his parents. From Paris, Chavagnac is a remote area of hills and pastures, which was populated mostly by peasants who gave allegiance to the Lafayette family. It was in this countryside, far from the French ruling aristocracy, where Lafayette spent his childhood years with peasant children as his playmates. And this really did help change the course of his life because his friends were peasants, not aristocracy. And that really kind of shaped his worldview from then on out. Lafayette's parents were high-ranking members of French nobility. His father, Gilbert du Motier, and you can see he inherited the name Gilbert from his father. He carried the inherited title of Marquis de Lafayette and was descended from a long line of military men dating back to the Crusades. At the time of young Lafayette's birth, his father was colonel in the French Grenadiers, which was an elite army of the French king. So he stood by the king in this grenadier group, and his father really was a war hero and had much action throughout his life. See some great photos there of the estate on the right, and then just below that is a picture of Lafayette's father, Gilbert, the senior. Lafayette's mother, Marie-Louise Joly de la Rivière, known as Julie, that's what they called her, was the daughter of a wealthy French aristocratic family who traced their lineage to King Louis IX. Julie had grown up in a grand house in Paris, but when she married Marquis de Lafayette in 1754, she left her family, friends, and her busy social life in Paris to go to the remote Chateau Chavagnac. You can see a fantastic picture of her there on the right that is actually still there at the chateau and estate. That's a picture of Julie, his mother. Lafayette's father was rarely home as he was most often away with his regiment, and Julie was left in the company of her mother-in-law and infant son. When Lafayette was not yet 2 years old, his father was killed while fighting against the British during the Battle of Minden in the 7 Years' War. It was at this time the young Lafayette assumed the title of Marquis passed down by his father. Grief-stricken, Lafayette's mother returned to Paris to live with her family, leaving her son at Chavagnac and the chateau to be raised by his grandmother and aunts. Even as a child, Lafayette wanted to be a soldier like men in his father's family. When Lafayette was 10, his mother sent for him to join her in Paris, where she was living with her family in Luxembourg Palace, which is a really beautiful palace near the Champs-Élysées. He was enrolled in school and began formal classical education. In addition to school, Lafayette's grandfather enrolled him in a military training program. Lafayette carried the hatred of the British for his entire life due to their role in the death of his father on the battlefield. So you can see very much how he's being shaped throughout his early years. Playing with peasant children, believing in people's rights, not thinking like aristocracy, even though he was part of it. And then, of course, his hatred for the British and thinking about, in the future, his role in the American Revolution. So in terms of his military career in the American Revolution, in his youth, Lafayette developed a fascination with the colonial conflict brewing in the Americas. In April of 1777, Lafayette embarked on the Victoire, which was a ship paid for with his personal funds, for North America, and he was desperate to serve as a military leader in the Revolution, despite a royal decree prohibiting French officers from serving in America. Shortly after arriving, the Continental Congress commissioned him as a major general, and he became a member of George Washington's staff. Lafayette participated in his first military engagement at the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777. So essentially, about 6 months after he arrived, he was already in battle. He suffered a wound in one of his legs in his first battle, but managed to calmly lead a Patriot retreat from that battle to save the men. Because of his composure and his courage at the moment, Washington commended him for bravery and military ardor in the battle and recommended him to Congress for the command of a division. So as you see, he had barely been in the Continental Army. He had barely been commissioned an officer. He had been wounded in his first battle, and already Washington was recognizing him. In fact, Lafayette spent the harsh winter of 1777 and 78 with Washington and his men at Valley Forge, suffering along with the other Continental soldiers in the frigid, disease-ridden encampment. He helped Washington at his darkest hour when he faced an internal threat from the Conway Cabal, a plot to drive Washington from his command by plotters. It's really interesting that all this politics was happening within the Continental Army to possibly remove George Washington, and he was helped very much by Lafayette, who supported Washington all the way. Over the course of the next year, Lafayette more intensely pursued the glory he so desperately wanted. The Continental Congress charged him with leading an invasion of Canada. Continental forces there amounted to less than half the number Congress had promised. Disappointed, he returned south, escaping the capture by the British that summer at Barren Hill, Pennsylvania, and at Delaware Bay. For his skillful retreat from Newport, Rhode Island, Lafayette earned another commendation, but this time for gallantry, skill, and prudence from the Continental Congress. Lafayette managed to secure leave and return home to France at the beginning of 1779, despite receiving a hero's welcome from the people. King Louis XVI tried and failed to secure his arrest, charging him with disobeying his orders prohibiting French soldiers in America. During Lafayette's time in France, he played an extremely crucial role in securing 6,000 French troops for the American cause. Returning to the colonies the next year in 1780, Lafayette's news of French aid greatly improved American morale. Since his departure, the crucial field of battle had moved to the south. Former patriot and infamous turncoat Benedict Arnold had committed treason and now wreaked havoc on the Virginia countryside as a British commander. Lafayette, in coordination with Baron von Steuben, hunted Arnold, who Washington had condemned to death if he was captured. By the fall of 1781, the Frenchman found himself at the center of the action and the culmination of the successful War of Independence. Lafayette and his men surrounded the British force at Yorktown, holding them until reinforced by Washington. Together, they initiated a siege that led to the British surrender and an end to the conflict. So you can see Lafayette really was involved in many different battles and activities and actions throughout the war, culminating in this huge victory and glory for himself and for the other officers when they were forcing the British to surrender at Yorktown. In terms of his relationship with America's founding fathers, Marquis de Lafayette's relationship with founding fathers, particularly George Washington, was one of deep respect, admiration, and affection, evolving into a familial bond. Lafayette's eagerness to support the American Revolution at a young age led to a close association with Washington, who viewed him as a trusted friend and even an adoptive son. Lafayette and Jefferson engaged in a rich correspondence back and forth, and as many of you know, Jefferson loved to write letters, and so did Lafayette. They would discuss various topics, including the University of Virginia, South American republics' independence, and the issue of slavery. Lafayette even challenged Jefferson on the morality of slavery, highlighting the contradiction between the ideals of liberty and the institution of slavery. So you can see a lot of the discussions that were happening in the colonies already. Some of them were being advanced by Lafayette. Lafayette also fostered a connection with John Adams. And during his triumphant tour of the United States in 1824, Lafayette visited Adams, who was then 89 years old, in Boston. So you see some great photos here on the top, Lafayette and Washington at Mount Vernon in 1784. So that was obviously after the war, and they had celebrated the independence of the country. Just below that is John Adams. To his right is a portrait of George Washington that hung on the wall of Lafayette's home in Paris. And actually, Lafayette named his first son George Washington Lafayette. And then a picture down below there is a picture of Lafayette with Thomas Jefferson. And the two of them with the correspondence, and then also the two of them coordinated together when they were helping to write certain very important documents in the formation of the new French government in 1789 after the Revolution. So after the American Revolution, Lafayette returned home to France, where he continued to fight for liberty and equality for all mankind in the midst of the French Revolution, which was breaking out. He became a de facto leader and symbol of the struggle for common man's rights. He bore witness to the tennis court oath and the storming of the Bastille, where he managed to get his hands on a key and send it to Washington's Mount Vernon home as a gift, where it resides even to this day, and even helped design the modern French tricolor flag after the people gained power and eradicated the king. It's really interesting that he had a role in designing that flag because he knew the flag in the United States was so important. More importantly, Lafayette authored the Declaration of Rights of Man with Emmanuel Joseph Sees and some input from Thomas Jefferson, one of the most important documents in world history that he wrote there in France, along with the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. You can consider those three the most important in forming a new government that was by the people, for the people. Not even Lafayette could escape the tumultuous days of the Revolution, however, and though he himself escaped the reign of terror, his wife Adrienne was arrested, and most of her family was actually executed by the mob. Lafayette instead fled the country, but was captured by France's Austrian adversaries and languished in Olmütz prison until 1799. So he was in prison for a full 5 years, when General Napoleon Bonaparte secured his freedom. Napoleon offered Lafayette membership into his new Legion d'Honneur and might have been offered him a marshalship had he been so inclined, but Lafayette chose instead to retire from politics and military service and did not participate in Napoleon's future conquests. It's really interesting there that Napoleon went out of his way to save this French hero from the French Revolution, and yet he was unable to talk him into serving the country, and Lafayette decided to retire and go back to his estate. So in terms of his involvement in the French Revolution, and you can see a picture of him there on the right, with his French military uniform on and the old French flag that he helped design. Lafayette was elected commander of the newly formed National Guard of Paris in 1789. He played a key role in maintaining order and was initially a popular figure, especially after the storming of the Bastille. Lafayette favored a constitutional monarchy, a system where the king's power would be limited by the Constitution, and he supported the idea of shifting power from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie. As the revolution became more radical, Lafayette's popularity waned. His actions, such as ordering troops to fire on demonstrators and his support for the king, drew criticism from revolutionaries who had gotten very radicalized. In 1792, after clashing with the more radical revolutionaries, Lafayette attempted to rally troops to march on Paris to protect the monarchy. Declared a traitor by the government, he fled France and was captured by Austrian forces, and as we said before, was imprisoned by Austria and Prussia until 1797, when Napoleon had him released. Lafayette returned to France after his release and later served in the post-Napoleonic national government. So he really waited until after Napoleon had lost power. He didn't believe in what Napoleon was doing, which was consolidating power. It went very much against his ideal of a government for the people. In terms of the tour of America, very famous tour he took many years later in 1824. He returned to the U.S. for a grand tour in which the people of every city greeted him with cheers and exuberant celebrations. President James Monroe and Congress invited Lafayette to visit the United States, in part to celebrate the nation's upcoming 50th anniversary. Monroe intended to have Lafayette travel on an American warship, but Lafayette felt that having such a vessel as transport was undemocratic and booked passage on the merchant ship Cadmus. Louis XVIII did not approve of the trip and had troops disperse the crowd that gathered at Le Havre to see him off. Lafayette arrived in New York on August 15, 1824, accompanied by his son, George Washington, and his secretary, Auguste Levasseur. He was greeted by a group of Revolutionary War veterans who had fought alongside him many years before. He also took time to visit his old friend Jefferson at his home in Monticello. Lafayette had intended to visit only the original 13 states during his 4-month visit, but the stay stretched to 16 months as he visited all 24 states. So pretty incredible. The country had grown from 13 to 24 during his time living in France. And now he'd come back many years later. The country was much larger, much more complex, and he ended up going to all 24 states and was greeted as the hero he was. See some great photos there on the right, a picture of a white commemorative glove that was given to many of the people that would come greet him at each stop with his picture on it. So you could actually get one of these gloves and put it on, and it had his photo. And then just below that is a picture of what he looked like on this 1824 tour. Of course, he was much older at this time. And that's what he looked like as a civilian touring the United States. So in terms of Lafayette's burial in Paris, Lafayette's grave is in downtown Paris beside his wife in the back of the cemetery adjacent to the walled-off area that contains 2 mass graves from victims of the French Revolution's guillotine. When he finally passed in 1834, he made a final wish to be buried under soil taken from Bunker Hill in Boston. And of course, Bunker Hill is the important location of that very important early battle in the American Revolution. And we just did a episode about it recently, Bunker Hill, and I'll go ahead and put the link to that episode if you'd like to watch it down in the description. Some soil from that hill was sent to Paris to be added to his funeral plot. So they went by his wish, and he actually had some dirt from Bunker Hill on his grave. For his involvement in both America and Europe, Lafayette has been remembered as the hero of 2 worlds and 2 revolutions. He insisted in his will to have the American flag flying at his gravesite, and you can see it's still there even today. And I used to live in Paris for a number of years, and during that time, we actually visited this Lafayette gravesite where he and his wife lay rest today. And they take very good care of it. You can see some pictures there on the bottom of what it looks like. And the American flag still rest there today, and they actually have a short celebration every year on July 4th at his gravesite. Let's talk about some of the famous Marquis de Lafayette quotes that came up during his time. The first one is, when the government violates the people's rights, insurrection is, for the people and for the portion of the people, the most sacred of rights and the most indispensable of duties. And he felt very strongly about this. If the government was violating people's rights and become too authoritarian, that it was really the duty of the people to overthrow that government. And you can see this is very much the way he thought when it came to revolution. Second one is, I gave my heart to Americans and thought of nothing else but raising my banner and adding my colors to theirs. So really pretty incredible if you think about this very young teenager, Marquis de Lafayette, taking that voyage against the king's will over to America and essentially threw himself all in to the American effort until they gained their independence. Still pretty incredible to think about. The next one is, good fortune of America is closely tied to the good fortune of all humanity. And he really believed that America wasn't just a country they were forming, but it was really an ideal. It was something that you could really get behind, which was this new form of government, this government for the people. And really he believed strongly that the fortune of America really was the fortune of the world. The next one is, true republicanism is the sovereignty of the people. There are natural and imprescribable rights which an entire nation has no right to violate. And this was very similar to Hobbes and some of the other great thinkers leading up to the American Revolution, the way they were talking about natural rights or rights from God that could not be infringed on by the government. And you can see that he very much believed that as well. Next one is, if the king refuses the Constitution, I shall oppose him. If he accepts it, I shall defend him. And the day on which he gave himself up as my prisoner secured me more fully to his service than if he had promised me half his kingdom. And so this is talking a lot about the beginning of the French Revolution, because this is actually what happened when they stormed the Bastille. The king had to give himself up to Lafayette and his men. And they took care of him and his family very well. They did not kill them, did not hurt them. And his goal was that if the king accepted the Constitution they had drafted, that it would be a constitutional monarchy. That was what he had designed. The next one is, the exercise of natural rights has no limits, but such as will ensure their enjoyment to other members of society. So again, his whole concept of natural rights or God's rights that can't be infringed on by the government. The Emperor Napoleon, ascending gradually from his post of national magistrate to seat himself upon the throne without limits, seems to have wished to punish, as for the abuse of the Republican reforms, by making us feel all the weight of absolute monarchy. So you can see this is the man who saved him from jail in Austria and pulled him out of jail and gave him his freedom back. And yet he very much opposed everything Napoleon was about. He felt he was trying to become a monarch. He was trying to become an emperor. He felt like he was the ultimate authoritarian, and he just didn't believe in what he was doing, and that's why he sat out of the Napoleonic government. Finally here, my grand affair appears settled, for America is certain of her independence. Humanity has gained her cause, and liberty will never be without a place of refuge. And this is how he felt about America. He loved America until the day he died. He always talked about it. He used it as the example for France and for every other country, and believed that its independence was truly God gained, and that liberty was worth dying for. So as you can see there, Lafayette was just a fascinating man, a true war hero on both sides of the Atlantic. Pretty incredible that he essentially left his cushy, very wealthy life, his aristocratic background, wanted to be a war hero, wanted to go join a cause that was bigger than himself. And he did that, and he did that multiple times in his life. And he always stood up for freedom. He always stood up for individual rights. And really a remarkable man and a remarkable leader, as you can see. Let's go ahead and take a look at a video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side. Well, just wanted to take a moment to do a shout out to our sponsor for tonight's Traveling Through History episode, and that is Barnes & Noble. And just one of my favorite places to go. Have one very close to my house. Go to it quite often. I like to go through there and just browse through all the great books and magazines. They have CDs, DVDs, everything you can imagine. They even have a little cafe in there. You can sit and drink your coffee or your hot chocolate. It's just a great time. And so definitely check out your local Barnes & Noble store or go to barnesandnoble.com and go check out a book and purchase something or just have a great afternoon sitting in there and looking at all the great offerings that they have. So again, thank you so much, Barnes & Noble, for sponsoring us tonight. We'll see you next time.
His name was Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. Born an aristocrat, but in America he became known simply as Lafayette. And while his many names may have been shortened, his list of accomplishments was certainly not. Orphaned at the age of 12, Lafayette grew up with a desire to distinguish himself and bring honor to his family. This is where his path met up with the cause of the American colonists and their revolution. Born on April 9, 1771, in Chavagnac in southern France, Lafayette came from a distinguished family where the men had a long tradition of military service. One of his ancestors had been a companion-at-arms of Joan of Arc's army during the siege of Orleans in 1429. He lost his father, Michel de Lafayette, when he was killed at the Battle of Minden in what is known as the 7 Years' War. Lafayette was just 2. His mother left Gilbert with his grandmother, and she went off to court to persuade King Louis XV for a small pension for her son and to try to earn a way into the respected court circles for him. But when Lafayette was 12, both his mother and his grandmother died, leaving him wealthy but alone. When he was 11, his mother summoned him to Paris to live with her and his great-grandmother, and he was sent to school at the Collège du Plessis, part of the University of Paris, and at the age of 13, he was commissioned as an officer into the Black Musketeers, Louis XV's personal horse guard. His duties were mostly ceremonial. At the age of 14, he was betrothed to the 12-year-old Marie Adrienne François de Noailles, the daughter of the Duc d'Ayen, and 2 years later they were married. After his marriage, he continued on with his education and was given a commission as a lieutenant in the Noailles Dragoons in 1773. And when he turned 18, he received the captaincy in the Dragoons that he had been promised. However, the French military was going through a paring down at the time, and soon he would have no such service in the military. About this time, he attended a dinner where he heard the English Duke of Gloucester, the brother of the King of England, sympathize with the plight of the American colonists, and later said, "My heart was dedicated." And when he heard French officers were going to America, he went to the American agent in France, Silas Deane, to beg to be sent as a commissioned officer to America. When he found out that the Continental Congress had no funds for his ocean voyage, he bought a ship, the Victoire, for £112,000 and left France without telling anyone. This greatly angered his wealthy, notable father-in-law, who had King Louis XVI issue orders to arrest him and bring him back to Paris. Lafayette pretended he was going to comply with the orders, but instead returned to his ship and set sail on a 2-month journey to the colonies, where his time was spent learning English and being quite seasick. He landed on North Island near Georgetown, South Carolina, on June 13, 1777. He was 19 years old. After a long journey to Philadelphia and getting a runaround from the members of the Continental Congress, it was finally agreed they would give him a commission as Major General to denote only his highborn status, not his military service. Lafayette agreed to serve without pay, and soon he was introduced to General George Washington at a dinner in Philadelphia. The two men liked each other at once and would become lifelong friends. It is said that Lafayette was baptized by fire into war at the Battle of Brandywine, his first taste of combat, where he was shot in the leg on September the 11th, 1777. Before seeing to his wound, he studied his troops and led them in an orderly pullback. After a 2-month recovery, he returned to the battle where he commanded a division previously led by Major General Adam Stephen, where he assisted General Nathanael Greene scout British positions in New Jersey, and with 300 soldiers he defeated the Hessian forces, which were much greater in number, on November 24, 1777. During the hard winter of 1777–78, he stayed with Washington at Valley Forge. During that time, he was asked to lead an invasion into Quebec from Albany, but when he got to Albany, he discovered that there were too few troops to mount an invasion. But the trip wasn't a total waste because he managed to convince the Oneida tribe to assist the Americans in the war. In February of 1779, Lafayette returned to Paris to recruit more help for the Americans. But since he had disobeyed King Louis XVI by leaving to go to America, he was placed under house arrest for 8 days. But this was merely a formality by the king, because Lafayette was given a hero's welcome back to France, and was given a gold-encrusted sword by Benjamin Franklin's grandson William Temple Franklin in Paris that had been commissioned by the Continental Congress. He continued to work with Benjamin Franklin and was able to secure more military power for the American Revolution, and was able to get 6,000 troops commanded by General Rochambeau before going back to the American forces and his beloved General Washington. On his return to Boston, he was celebrated, but he found the morale low. He shared the news that the French and Rochambeau were coming to the aid of the Americans, and with the help of Alexander Hamilton, wrote to the officials of each state asking for them to provide more troops and provisions. Lafayette continued leading troops in battle and was ordered by Washington to go after the traitor Benedict Arnold, who was by then commanding British forces in Philadelphia. Yorktown was his last real battle in the American Revolution. He and his 400 men took Redoubt No. 9, after his comrade and friend Alexander Hamilton and his men took Redoubt 10. These two victories were the linchpin in getting through the British defenses and allowed eventual success and surrender of General Cornwallis. Although war was to go on another year, the victory at Yorktown was essentially the end of the American Revolution. Lafayette was appointed as an advisor to America's envoys in Europe, Benjamin Franklin in Paris, John Jay in Madrid, and John Adams in The Hague. In January of 1782, Lafayette received yet another hero's welcome in Paris and was received at the Palace of Versailles. In France, he worked with Thomas Jefferson to establish trade agreements between France and the American colonies. He joined the French abolitionist group, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. In the late 1780s, Lafayette became a key figure in the French Revolution, which descended into mad chaos and anarchy. In 1789, he presented his draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which he wrote himself with Thomas Jefferson providing input. The following day, a group of insurgents stormed the Bastille. With much acclaim, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the French National Guard, whose job it was to establish and maintain order under the control of the French Assembly. In October of 1789, after the king rejected the declaration, a group of women fishmongers marched to Versailles, angry over the scarcity of materials to make bread. Reluctantly, Lafayette led them and tried to broker a peace between the monarchs and the people. But in trying to keep the peace and establish a constitutional monarchy, Lafayette made many enemies. He began to be loathed by members of each faction, and after the king and his family almost escaped France, Lafayette was blamed by extremists as he was responsible for the royal family's custody, and they felt he was a royal sympathizer. On August 14, 1792, a warrant was issued for Lafayette's arrest. Hoping to escape to the United States and President Washington, he entered the Austrian Netherlands, but was taken prisoner by Frederick William II of Prussia, who saw him as an instigator and feared he would try to overthrow monarchy in Austria. He appealed to his beloved general, now President Washington, for help, but the United States was on the brink of hostilities with France itself at that time, and the situation was precarious. But through his many allies and friends on both sides of the Atlantic, Lafayette was finally released after 5 years on September 19, 1797. With the help of his beloved wife, Adrienne, Napoleon Bonaparte restored Lafayette's French citizenship in 1800. In 1824, Lafayette was invited by President James Monroe to visit the United States for the upcoming 50th anniversary of the nation's birth. He arrived in New York on August 15, 1824, with his son, George Washington Lafayette, and was greeted with great fanfare by now aged Revolutionary veterans. The celebrations lasted for 4 solid days and nights before he departed for Boston. Thinking it would be a relaxing trip, he was surprised to find the route lined with cheering citizens at every town along the way. He was one of the last of the Revolutionary leaders by that time. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia all attempted to outdo each other with their celebrations for Lafayette's visit, and massive building projects were begun in preparation for his arrival, and as a mason, he laid the cornerstone for many new buildings in each city as he visited. His stay in the United States was 16 months, and he visited all of the now 24 states in the Union, each giving him enormous welcomes, including the naming of cities in his honor, such as Fayetteville, North Carolina. He visited Washington, D.C., and was surprised by the simplicity of President Monroe, and stopped at Mount Vernon to pay his respects to his dear friend and former commander, George Washington. He was even in Washington to witness one of the most contentious presidential elections, in which there was a tie in the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives elected John Quincy Adams as president. He shook hands with the runner-up, Andrew Jackson, and visited his home in Tennessee. On September 6th, he celebrated his 68th birthday at the White House with President John Quincy Adams, and departed for home the next day. He took many gifts with him, including a large tract of land that had been gifted to him by Congress, and a large gift of $200,000 for his service to the country during the war, a much-needed gift since the once wealthy Marquis had lost his fortune during the French Revolution. In February 1834, Lafayette collapsed from pneumonia. He got better for a time, but the terrible weather in May caught him outside in a thunderstorm. He died on May 20th, 1834, at the age of 76. He was buried next to his beloved Adrienne in Picpus Cemetery under American soil from Bunker Hill that he had brought back from his trip to the United States. King Louis Philippe ordered a military funeral in order to keep the public from attending, and crowds formed to protest their exclusion. In the United States, when President Andrew Jackson heard of his death, he ordered that the same honors bestowed on Washington at his death should be given to America's adopted son, and both houses of Congress were draped in black for 30 days, and members of Congress wore mourning badges. Gone was this last surviving hero of the American and French Revolution. Gone was this great protector of freedoms, Lafayette. And he is how history happens.
He was born Gilbert de Motier de Lafayette, a direct descendant of bold French knights who fought in the Crusades and alongside Joan of Arc. During the American Revolution, he became one of George Washington's most trusted commanders. Much more than comrades in arms, the two were like father and son.
The moment Lafayette saw Washington, he said, "That's the man I want to be like."
Lafayette was an inexperienced 19-year-old when he arrived in America. Within 5 years, he would become skilled in both conventional and guerrilla-type tactics, and would play an important role in the critical Patriot victory at Yorktown, the battle that ultimately won the Revolution.
He had a kind of sense of destiny, and he was willing to take risks and not worry.
The Marquis de Lafayette, August 25th, 1777. A British army under the command of General William Howe has landed about 45 miles from Philadelphia, the capital city of the Patriot cause. As the British advance, George Washington sets his defensive lines along Brandywine Creek, one of the last physical barriers between the invading British army and the capital.
Philadelphia was the informal capital of the American Revolution. It was where Congress was meeting, it was where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And General Howe hoped that taking Philadelphia would be the means to victory. Howe thought of Philadelphia as being like London. If you captured London, you took Britain. If you took Philadelphia, you took America.
With a holding force threatening to cross the Brandywine and attack Washington, the main British force circled around and came in behind the Americans. Alongside Washington that day was a young Frenchman who had volunteered for service in the Continental Army. His name was the Marquis de Lafayette, and although his military skills were untested, he held the rank of Major General.
Lafayette, I doubt if he actually tugged on Washington's sleeve, but he pestered Washington so much, saying, let me go into battle, let me go into battle, let me just go out there and fight. Finally, Washington, just to get rid of him, because he was trying to talk to his other officers, said, okay, go ahead.
Lafayette rode into the center of the battle, at precisely the spot where British troops were concentrating their heaviest fire. The Continentals were coming undone in the face of the furious attack, panic-stricken into a frenzied retreat.
Lafayette actually threw himself into the fight and tried to rally these American troops with whom he could hardly communicate because, remember, his English is still very poor at this point. But he stood his ground.
Finally, he got off his horse to rally them, and these men rallied around Lafayette, and he finally got them regrouped so that they could retreat in order back to the safety of the woods.
Who was this impetuous, daring young Frenchman? Why was he risking his life for Washington and the American cause? Some of the answers can be found in his distinguished lineage. Lafayette was a man born and bred to be a warrior. He belonged to one of the wealthiest families in France. When Lafayette was just 2 years old, his father was killed by the British in the 7 Years' War. It was a painful loss that would help shape Lafayette's destiny. From the time I was 8, he would write in his memoirs, I longed for glory.
Lafayette was very aware of the military traditions in his family. He was very aware of the noble tradition of service to the king and of military action. And so I think that was an influence on him. From an early age, he wanted to make a mark in the world, and he believed that the military was the way a man of his class could do that.
For the impressionable young nobleman with a thirst for glory and the military in his blood, the American Revolution became both a quest and a calling. Lafayette was not the only French officer to embrace the revolution, but he was one of the most prominent. Early in 1777, Silas Deane, the American representative in Paris, granted the persistent young Frenchman a commission as a major general in the Continental Army. Lafayette was just 19, had never commanded troops in the field, had never faced hostile fire. He didn't even speak English. Nevertheless, he set sail for his destiny in America, despite the fact that his own king had ordered him not to go.
As an officer in the French army, he would have moved up in the ranks. He was assured of a safe and secure career. In giving all that up, he was taking a risk that's very hard to imagine how a 19-year-old boy would make that decision, because he was really almost a boy.
In the summer of 1777, Lafayette arrived in Philadelphia to present his military commission to Congress.
And Lafayette arrives at the Congress and says, here I am. I know you're going to be pleased. I'm here to join the Continental Army. And the Congress at that point was very skeptical of these French volunteers who had been streaming into Philadelphia now for quite a few months. And they basically said, sorry, we don't need any more French officers. They weren't impressed by the fact that he had a promise of a commission from Silas Deane in Paris.
Lafayette was unshaken by the cold reception. As it turned out, the young Frenchman had a friend in high places.
Ben Franklin, by this point, had gone to Paris. So a letter arrived shortly after Lafayette arrived in Philadelphia. It said, Lafayette is very well connected. You need to pay attention to this young man. He can help us. And people at the Congress immediately got more interested in Lafayette.
But it was more than Lafayette's stature and his royal connections that impressed members of Congress.
The difference with Lafayette was that they became convinced of the genuineness of his commitment to the American cause.
Unlike everyone else who fought in the war at that point, he was the only one who stood to gain nothing economically or politically
On July 31st, 1777, an act of Congress granted the Marquis de Lafayette an honorary commission in the Continental Army at the rank of Major General. That same evening, the fatherless French officer would meet the father of the American Revolution for the first time. It was the beginning of an intense, enduring friendship, one that would help change the course of the war. Lafayette was just 13 years old when he joined the King's Black Musketeers, the same regiment that would be immortalized in the timeless novel, The Three Musketeers. July 31st, 1777, Philadelphia. George Washington is in the capital to make plans against the impending British attack. At a well-known local tavern, he takes time for a late supper with a few members of Congress. When the Marquis de Lafayette is presented to Washington, there is an obvious rapport.
What Lafayette did immediately in his conversation with Washington, he said, "I've come here to learn from you and from the American Army. I'm not here as a teacher. I'm here to learn from the American Army." And this made a great impression on Washington because all of the other foreigners who had been coming from Europe came with the idea that they were going to teach the American Army what they needed to do to be a good army.
The bond between the two men was almost instantaneous and went far beyond Washington's admiration for Lafayette's humility.
The moment Lafayette saw Washington, he already was his hero. And he looked at him and he said, "That's the man I want to be like." That was the father he had always fantasized. And Washington saw Lafayette and said, "That's the son I've always wanted, someone who wants to be a soldier."
And from the beginning, there was something that happened between the two of them. And other people noticed it as well. They said, there's something unusual about the affection that General Washington feels for this young Frenchman.
Evidence of this special relationship would become apparent when Washington asked Lafayette to attend a council of war with his top generals to plan the defense of Philadelphia. A few days later, Washington reluctantly sent Lafayette into the Battle of Brandywine Creek, where he helped rally the Patriot troops into an orderly retreat. But the young Frenchman would not escape unscathed. His first taste of combat was very nearly his last.
In this struggle, he was shot in the leg and immediately began to bleed, and others recognized that he had been wounded. But it was typical of Lafayette at this point to try to show that he was a courageous volunteer for the cause, and he refused to leave the battle until the troops themselves pulled back from the fight.
Washington heard of Lafayette's courage under fire, heard of Lafayette's wound, and was at Riverside when they were loading the wounded onto various barges to sail them upriver to Philadelphia. And he saw Lafayette being loaded on a barge and went to the doctor and said, "Take care of him as if he were my own son."
I think what Washington meant by that was that Lafayette was from a very important French family, and if he died at this point in his career, it would be very bad for the American cause. So I think when he says treat Lafayette as if he is my son, he means give him the best care you possibly can, and don't treat him as just another member of the ranks.
Although Lafayette had shown courage at Brandywine Creek, the Americans lost the battle, and the British soon took Philadelphia. After another defeat at Germantown a few weeks later, Washington went to winter quarters in Valley Forge, while Lafayette recuperated from his wound. Throughout his convalescence, Lafayette took time to write home. In correspondence with his wife and family, he apologized for the royal embarrassment caused by his departure. He also extolled the virtues of the Continental Army and the Revolution.
He began writing letters back to France, explaining that these were good soldiers, that this was a noble cause, that this was an opportunity for France to make a contribution not only to America, but perhaps to its own interest, which was to reduce the power of the British Empire. And so, in his letters to his family, in his letters to the French government officials whom he knew, he began to argue this is a cause France should support.
The young nobleman who had left France against the king's wishes was now starting to influence its foreign policy. When news of the British surrender at Saratoga reached Paris, the king was finally moved to act. In December, Benjamin Franklin was received at Versailles, and France soon recognized the United States as an independent nation.
The French were looking for a way to weaken the British Empire. Their public claim was that they were helping the people of America gain their freedom. Behind closed doors, what the French government officials were really hoping to do was to strike a blow at the British Empire.
Meanwhile, Lafayette was also writing letters to George Washington, begging for his own command. Consider, if you please, that Europe, and particularly France, is looking upon me, that I want to do something by myself and justify that love of glory which I let be known to the world. Washington responded favorably to Lafayette's appeal and asked Congress to give him command over a division of the Continental Army. On December 1st, 1777, Congress granted Washington's request.
Washington gave Lafayette a field command. And many of the other officers were a little skeptical of Lafayette to begin with. And in fact, many of these officers became lifelong friends of Lafayette later on. Now, I would say with that officer corps around Washington being convinced of Lafayette's competence to handle this job, even though a very, very young man, again shows that Lafayette was a remarkable soldier.
By the end of 1777, Lafayette had been in America less than 6 months. He had fought with distinction and been seriously wounded in action. Still just 19, Lafayette now commanded a full division of Patriot troops and was a favorite son of George Washington. The foundation for Lafayette's legend had been laid, but the events of the next few months would test the young general in ways that he never imagined. Throughout the United States, from Maine to California and Minnesota to Louisiana, there are 44 cities or counties named in honor of the Marquis de Lafayette.
You can see some really fascinating stuff there about Lafayette. Obviously, he left his life of privilege, his life of nobility, a French officer's career, which would have been a guaranteed career throughout his life. He could have become a politician. He left his family and his wife. He left his friends and all of his ability to be influential in France. He left all of that behind, and he went against the king's wishes and got on a ship that he purchased and sailed to a new country to help it fight for its independence. So it's really a remarkable story if you think about it. Arrives at 19 years old and immediately goes into battle with George Washington, gets wounded, gets a number of commendations, and then 6 months later, he is now commanding a force on the battlefield, and ends up becoming one of George Washington's most trusted advisors, most trusted leaders, and helps the Americans, in the end, get its independence in the American Revolution. It's truly a remarkable story. And then after that, that would have been enough to make him famous and to make him a true war hero, as you can see, with 44 cities around the U.S. and Lafayette Square and Fayetteville, North Carolina, all these places named after him. But instead, he goes on to be part of 2 more revolutions in France and to truly have one of the most remarkable lives of any revolutionary you can imagine. So truly an incredible life, as you can see there. Hopefully you really enjoyed tonight's program. You learned a lot about Marquis de Lafayette, or Gilbert as they called him, and that you are able to gain the same respect that I've always had for him my whole life. And you see that he's worth reading about, he's worth digging into and learning more about. His legacy is truly one of a kind, as you can see. And we owe him a huge debt of gratitude as a country. So thank you so much for joining the program tonight. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great programs coming your way. And again, we love all of your comments, and we really enjoy everything that you give back to us in terms of feedback. And drop us a comment and tell us another program you'd like us to do in the future, and we'll definitely do that. So thank you so much for joining Traveling Through History. Hope you love history as much as we do. Have a great night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the state.